A few months ago, I was sitting in a class during a discussion on history. It was just a normal conversation, people sharing opinions, agreeing, disagreeing. But at one point, the discussion shifted and someone said something that stayed with me. At least Adolf Hitler was a nationalist. He believed in unifying Germany. And what struck me wasn't just the statement itself, it was how easily that was said. There was no strong reaction, no real debate. Even I didn't say anything. It just passed as a reasonable point. And this is exactly what made it unsettling. Because when something like that starts sounding normal, it forces us to ask a deeper question. Was he really a nationalist? Or are we misunderstanding what nationalism actually means? Let's begin carefully now. Nationalism at its core means loyalty to one's nation, a commitment to protect its people, preserve its sovereignty, and contribute to its progress. But nationalism is often misunderstood. It is not blind pride. It is not the belief that one nation is superior to all others. True nationalism carries responsibility. It asks, how do we strengthen our nation without dehumanizing others? The moment it turns into domination, it stops being nationalism. And this is where an important distinction comes in. There is a difference between nationalism and ultranationalism. Nationalism seeks to strengthen a nation. Ultranationalism seeks to elevate one nation above all others, often at the cost of others. That difference may sound subtle, but historically it has meant the difference between stability and catastrophe. Thinkers like Rabindranath Tagore warned about this. He argued that when nationalism becomes aggressive, it stops serving humanity and begins serving power. Now, to be fair, why do some people still call Adolf Hitler a nationalist? Maybe because he spoke the language of nationalism. He talked about restoring pride, reviving the economy, uniting the people. And yes, I understand that after World War I, Germany faced severe consequences: economic collapse, political instability, and the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles like disarmament and reparation. These conditions created resentment and created vulnerability, and they made radical ideas more appealing. But acknowledging this is not the same as justifying what followed, because suffering can explain the rise of an ideology, but it cannot justify the destruction it causes. And this brings us to a crucial point. An idea should not be judged by what it claims, but by what it produces. When we examine his ideology, especially in his own autobiography, Mein Kampf, we see something far more dangerous. First, racial hierarchy. Human beings were ranked. And when a system ranks human beings, it creates framework where inequality becomes acceptable and eventually violence becomes justifiable. Second, racial purity. The idea that a nation must remain pure in order to survive. But this defines belonging not by values but by identity. And once people are defined as outsiders, it becomes easier to deny them rights and eventually their humanity. Third, expansion. Lebensraum. The belief that Germany needed more land, even if it meant taking it from others. This is not protection. This is domination. And these ideas did not remain theoretical. They translated into action. Austria was annexed, Czechoslovakia was dismantled, and in 1939 the invasion of Poland triggered Second World War. This was not defensive nationalism, it was the logical outcome of an expansionist ideology. And the consequences? The consequences were catastrophic. World War II led to an estimated 70 to 85 million deaths. Not just numbers, but lives, families, entire futures erased. Among the darkest outcomes was the Holocaust, where around 6 million Jews were systematically killed, along with millions of others, as documented by institutions like the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. And even Germany, the very nation this ideology claimed to uplift, was left devastated, divided, and broken. So let me ask you directly now, if an ideology justifies the suffering of millions, would you still support it? Tell me honestly, if you really think Hitler was a nationalist, would you allow yourself or your family members to be the victims of his so-called nationalism? Not in theory, but in reality. Because ideas often feel acceptable from a distance, but they feel very different when you place yourself within their consequences. And if the answer is no, then that tells us something important. An idea that demands the suffering of others can not be called nationalism. Nationalism protects the nation. This ideology destroyed not only other nations, but even its own. So the issue is not just historical, it is conceptual. We are calling something by the wrong name. And that misleading is dangerous, far more dangerous than we think. Because when we misunderstand ideas, we risk normalizing them. Perhaps that is why the world still observes International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Not just to remember the past, but to remind ourselves of what happens when dangerous ideas go unchallenged. We risk repeating them in different forms under different names. So, was Adolf Hitler a nationalist? Or was he something far more dangerous? An example of how easily an idea can be distorted. And the real question is, are we better today at recognizing such distortions? Or are we still learning the same lessons again and again?